Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Followers. This is episode 22, and today we have a very interesting guest for you in Stephen Casey, more recently of Blackrock and Blarney County Championship fame as their S&C, and has in the past worked with a lot of the underage structures in Cork. So we're here today to give him a firm grilling on his thoughts and approaches to training, or more likely we'll just take notes and learn from him. So let's jump right in. Stephen, if you want to give us a little bit of just background on what's gotten you to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Timmy. Yeah, I basically started off, I suppose, my strength and conditioning career, like most people, became a personal trainer, and got into a job as a gym instructor in Planet Health in Blackpool. From there, then I was there about a year, and I went after that to the Mardyke Arena in UCC. And I suppose from that was the turning point for me in terms of going from a gym instructor to strength and conditioning. I got to work with a lot of teams with UCC, with rugby and soccer and ultimate frisbee and hockey and Olympic lifting and powerlifting and sprinters. And I just got a huge array of athletes I was very lucky to work with across the 6 years. From there, I pursued the masters in UL. At that stage, I suppose I'd gotten a lot of qualifications, as everyone does, in terms of online work and things like that, and weekend courses, and did all those things, and then went to UL to do my master's in sports performance. Was up there for a year. Did my master's thesis looking at squat mechanics, and the premise basically that if you're working with basketballers or volleyballers, that if you were doing a deep squat, are they more likely to get injured? Is there more forces going through, let's say, spine and knee due to their femur and shank lengths? And from there, I started with Blackrock and the Cork Miners. That was my first year with hurling specifically. And then year on year, then it went from the Cork Miners to Cork 21s to Cork 20s, and then finished up with Cork last year. Started with Blarney 2 years ago, so there was an overlap there where I was involved with the Cork 20s, Blarney and Blackrock. And just this year then we started with Blarney and Blackrock, and was very lucky to have a very good successful season with them, with both clubs. I suppose culminating in 2 county championships. And then between all of that, I suppose I've just been always researching things and going after things in that capacity, and I suppose that's led me to where I am now, in the short of it.
And what were your own, say when you were younger, what sports were you mainly into yourself? Is that, like, were you into hurling? That's
my
how you
main
ended up there, or were you into other stuff?
I was always into soccer, and then I was a very average soccer player, and I broke my leg and had a very bad leg break. So I had 3 surgeries on the leg. It never really healed properly. So I did love sports and I loved training. So I suppose everyone's kind of got this story where suddenly I want to keep doing the fitness thing. What am I going to do? And maybe they become a gym instructor or a personal trainer. And I suppose that's the route I went down. I was always going to the gym anyway. But with the injury, I was kind of out for about 2 years between the surgeries, and I said, right, so I'll start taking this thing a bit more seriously now. And that's kind of led me down to the gym instructing, personal trainer route, and it followed on from there, really.
And from working with different types of athletes, say back when you were in the Mardyke and you were seeing them from different sports, did you notice any kind of differences, partly in physical qualities, but more like mentality towards fitness training, S&C, all like that?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, there is a level in terms of, there's an expectancy across the board, depending on what team you're involved with. So I've always been fascinated by the fact that, why does a sprinter choose sprinting? Why does a distance runner choose distance running? Why does a hurler choose hurling? And I think a lot of the times personalities seem to match up with that. That kind of the individual kind of sports seem to be very intense individuals, you know. And that was always my safety net anyway. That's why I always told people I love doing team sports. You know, if I'm playing soccer, I can blame 10 other people if I'm losing the game. Whereas if I'm playing golf or I'm being a sprinter and I lose, there's only one person to blame really. So there's a lot of intensity comes with that. So there's a bit of pressure. So you would have seen different attitudes then coming into the gym. In terms of the conditioning side of things, yeah, you'd see that too. You know, you'd see lads who, I suppose in a lot of cases you talk to people and their first go-to is, I'm not fit enough. And the question then has to be, well, how fit do you need to be? Do you know, what is your position? What is your sport? What is fitness? That's the ultimate question, isn't it? People ask, I need to be fitter, and say, well, define fitness for me. What constitutes you being fitter? And often cases people say, I need to run more, or I need to run faster, I need to be bigger, I need to be stronger. And that's what I found in team sports, is that lads have an idea, but they don't really know. And then in individual sports, they're very specific with what they need. They kind of know what they need because maybe their coach would have given them feedback, because that's the other beauty with singular sports. You have a coach looking at one individual. So team sports is a bit harder to monitor everyone. So yeah, I would have definitely seen differences across the board there.
Individual athletes are probably a bit more introspective about it all as well.
Yeah, they are. And of course there's pressure then, because an individual athlete wants to see results faster. You know, they have everything monitored and things like that, and they want to see improvements pretty quick. But it's enjoyable. It's enjoyable. Obviously, I suppose we're all in it because you want to see somebody getting better. And that is the whole point of being a strength and conditioning coach, is that you're improving an individual, be it in a team sport or in an individual sport.
Yeah, just to touch on your masters then, Noel. I did my undergrad in Noel, and we would have heard a lot about the sports performance masters. A few of us would look to do it, only we ended up getting teaching jobs and sold out on S&C when taking the government's money. But it was always very well spoken of, and still is, even though more masters programs have come on board. The UL one is often still looked at as kind of one of the peak ones, really. But what are some of the things you learned on that? Not just because even just before we came on air, we were chatting about people you're still in contact with, and we'd have heard of quite a few of them from working in professional sport, but module wise, but even away from specific to college and academic learning, what did you pick up as well?
Well, the biggest thing I picked up on was having what everyone is known as is the evidence-based theory behind your training method. So I'd have kind of been a bit green to that when I started. Like we were talking off air, I've no undergraduate, so doing stuff like assignments and the thesis itself would have been a lot of work for me, because I never was exposed to that. This idea that you can't just rock up to a team and do whatever you want. That would have been my thought process in the past. I'd just say, I'll just take this program and run that with them, and they're getting fitter. Look, it's great. Whereas I just became more accountable for what I was doing with athletes and saying, look, there has to be a thought process. Why are we doing this many sets? Why are we doing this many reps? Why are we doing this percentage? Why are we taking a rest on this day? How do we recover better? How do we become better? This idea that you couldn't just run the legs off people. I knew that going in anyway, but the idea that you can't just read a book and implement that, because the book could be read by somebody who has no idea whatsoever about evidence-based training. So you're just saying, oh yeah, look, when you're looking at research and looking up the stats and all those kind of things, that definitely woke me up to that. And I suppose that's the caliber of the course. As we talked about, the amount of people that when I did the masters, and I'm sure you've heard of loads of the people who've done the masters who are still in the industry. I think that speaks a lot about the masters itself, because we covered so many different modules. We covered a lot, and it was never simply focusing on team sports. We looked at endurance athletes. We looked at a small bit on nutrition. We looked at performance analysis. We looked at physiology. And like with my thesis, I had to look at squat mechanics. So I had to look up kinematics and all the rest of it, So you were kind of left going, right, there's a lot to learn here. But because the course was so well done and still is well done, I think that just stands to it then that so many people are still in the industry and still working.
What drew you to that topic for your thesis? Was it like something you'd noticed, or was it just kind of, this is something I feel like I could do? Well,
I used to do Olympic lifting, and I had a brainwave that I was going to change the world there with ankle mobility. I said, sure, the whole reason, lads, I can't squat to death is ankle mobility, and that's obviously the reason for that, so I need to go prove that. And you were given a broad range of topics that you were allowed to pick. You couldn't really say one thing. You were given pre-programmed kind of topics, and that was the one that I could see that I could change the most. So I said, oh, squat mechanics, that's kind of ankle. I'll just ask. My supervisor was Giles Warrington, Dr. Giles Warrington, and I'd asked him, can I put in ankle mobility? And he said, you're going to have a lot of data here, Steve, because we looked at 3D motion analysis and all the rest of it. And I said, yeah, that's fine. And I used it, but I didn't use it in the thesis because I remember going to one of my other supervisors, who was Dr. Ian Kenny, and being distraught because I proved nothing. Squat mechanics, shank length, femur length. There wasn't one determinant of squat depth. There was so many other variables. So what I proved was that shank length didn't really matter. Femur length didn't really matter because there was so much more going on. So I would have looked at ankle mobility of, let's say, somebody who was 6'5", and said, okay, he's not going to be able to squat to depth, or his ankle mobility may not be very good. And then when I looked at his squat and the 3D analysis, he didn't, even if he had good ankle mobility, he didn't actually use it in his squat. He didn't need it. So I would have always been a stickler, especially with my Olympic lifters, that you work on your ankle mobility and you'll get that squat depth. Now, some of them did get that squat depth, but there was more going on. It couldn't have been, you can't just zero in on one joint and say, yeah, it's ankle mobility that's determining that. So I would have been a bit gutted after it, but that's why I went after it. I thought I was going to change the world. I was going to get phone calls from the NBA and everything, but hasn't happened yet, unfortunately.
I think they just have a digit wrong on your number. They're
maybe, yeah, and COVID has obviously thrown it out of it as well. You know, they can't go over there.
Yeah. Maybe at that point then, what are your thoughts on propping up people's ankles when doing squat work? With, you know, if they have a deficiency or border, I don't know, is deficiency the right word? It probably isn't.
Yeah.
On propping up ankles. I would be prone to doing that quite a bit now with a lot of people I work with, particularly team sport athletes.
Yeah, and I'd definitely be along that side as well, John. I'd say I always do it with lads, especially my team sport athletes, and especially if we're in like a GPP phase or we're doing a hypertrophy block and I want full flexion, extension in the knee and the hip. More often than not, like, my lads will be squatting with elevated heels because I want that depth. But I think the fact that somebody would say I'm giving them ankle mobility by propping up their heels, I'm not so sure how well that washes. I think we are getting squat depth because we're doing that, but I don't think you can specifically say that it's the ankle mobility. That there's other things going on, that you're not just creating that ankle mobility. There's other things going on as well, but I am all for that. And I suppose that comes back to veer off the point, would be a lot of people would say, no, we're going to learn mechanics. Like, we're going to learn squat mechanics for the next 4 to 6 weeks because you can't get depth. Whereas I'd be more of the thing, well, we can't get depth if we elevate the heels. If we do 4 to 6 weeks of squat mechanics with no loading, they're not getting stronger. They're not getting better at the lift, because we know when we load a fella, he's going to have a different squat pattern than when he's unloaded. So I would say, okay, well, look, let's just do elevated heels. And we load that way then. So we can promote that, again, knee flexion, hip flexion, hip and ankle and all the rest, and we're getting full flexion. So it's again that question, I suppose, where people say, oh, we have to learn mechanics, whereas I'd be saying there's a time to learn mechanics and you can put that in, but not to the detriment of the whole point of the process anyway. Some people, they may not have been told to squat for 2 months. Like, they may go to somebody and say, okay, we're not going to learn, we're not going to load you until you can squat perfectly. So, well, they're not going to get stronger if you're going to inhibit them for 6 weeks. They're not getting stronger. So season's going to come around whether they have good squat mechanics or not. So I'd be more of the fact that, you know what, let's elevate heels. We can work on squat mechanics, part of our warm up. We're going to get that flexibility anyway, because we know we get more flexible as we obviously train through a full range of motion. So, and we can still load them. So they're stronger, at least when they go back after the 6 weeks, rather than the other side of things where people are just afraid to load athletes. And I don't think that's a good idea either.
To a point, like, the majority of gym work we do is a means to an end. It's there to support what it is you play on the field. And
yes, yeah.
Like, squatting is a good way to develop leg and hip strength and just all around, like, you know, back strength in general. And if adding an elevation to someone's heel helps support that, then great. Plus, I know Quinn Hennock would have spoken a good bit as well about just elevating the heel. It creates that counterbalance for you to not necessarily learn mechanics, but support or facilitate better mechanics that hopefully would then develop from that.
Yeah, and you'd see like you see a couple of lads like Joel Smith talking about this idea that if we go into a squat, and a lot of times when you're told to squat, you're told push through like the heel of the foot, and that's not really a natural process for the body. Like so, like kind of an ideal situation, you'd have them more forward, saying like push through the ball, because if you get a fella who's squatting with full intent, which is what you want to hear that kind of click off the weights at the top. They're going to come up off the ball of the foot. You know, they're just going to do that because the knee and the hip are going to act together and they come up off the ball of the foot. And the first question then is, oh, my heels came up. And that's naturally going to happen. So I'm not too bothered about that. Whereas when you say to somebody, I want you to squat and I want you to push off the heels, that's not really great for biomechanics. Like, it's not what the body wants to do. It wants to use full extension, like full triple extension. So that it is going to be on the ball of the foot. So I kind of push lads to be more pushing off the ball of the foot or the midfoot rather than the heel.
I'd be the exact same at pushing through the midfoot. Just think, we're going to have to change the name of this podcast soon, because the last few guests we've had, it's just been pure and utter confirmation bias. We're going to have to get someone on soon that we disagree with over everything, just to like, challenge us on something.
You have to get on somebody controversial then, John.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of those lads as well.
Taking it back then to your times, you're saying one of the first teams you work with were the Cork Miners. So was that, it's where an awful lot of people start is working with minor teams or youth teams and stuff. Yeah. Did you approach that kind of from a straight up S&C coach and you learned what was best with adults and implemented that with youths, or did you have quite a reasonably well developed mindset towards developing youths at the time, or was it something you kind of learned along the way?
Well, I was lucky because when I was in the Mardyke, I was with their Rebel Oak program. So I was in the Mardyke for 6 years, and the Rebel Oak program was in there for about 3. So their under 13s, 14s, and 15s would have been training midterm with us anyway. So that was the beauty of me going into minor, is a lot of the lads knew me and I knew them already. So it worked well for everyone. When I started with the lads, we would have looked at. We trained in the gym out in CIT, and we would have looked at that stuff where, I mean, I'd always say to people, if you could take back your time, you'd obviously do something different. Otherwise, we haven't learned anything, you know. So when we started off, we would have done probably hex bar deadlifts, bench, things like that. Not a million miles away from what I would have done anyway, but maybe the programming element would have been different. These lads in particular, especially when they were in Rebel Oak, the fella who was very good at football tended to be very good at hurling, tended to be very good at soccer, tended to be very good at multiple sports, and that kind of got forgotten about, I thought, in a lot of ways, because they were kind of said, like, I remember I was working with Munster as part of my the Masters, and one of the young fellas there said to me, he said, oh, I'm doing a periodization plan now, you know, with my club. I said, okay, what phase are you at? And he's about 16. Like, he said, I'm doing a power plan. I said, well, you're doing a volume plan here. You're doing a power plan with them. So how does that work? You know, and I think when I started with the Cork Miners, I was like, okay, the beauty about this is that the lads have already established that this is my sport. You know, I don't think what had happened was the footballers at the time had decided not to have dual players, so lads had to make a decision that wasn't on our end. That was just a decision made on the other end. So when I had them in, they were exclusively for me, so we could kind of work on those things. We looked at just the stuff in the gym. We looked at squat mechanics, hip hinging, bench press, the stuff that everyone does really. And then when it came out onto the pitch, again, if I could take back my time, I think I probably emphasized too much on the conditioning element and not enough on the other things like playing the game and things like that. So I would have looked at, they would have come back obviously with fitness tests. We would have ran the Bronco at the time, and we just looked at improving those tests. But the following year with the 21s, things would have been a lot different based on what I learned with the lads. We would have had the lads doing the Bronco test. Our superstars, who will remain nameless, didn't do very well in Bronco. But then we had GPS units on them for a challenge game against Dublin, and these lads would run through walls for you. And it's just that maybe the incentive for a fitness test isn't the same as them playing their sport. So I kind of started to look at things a lot differently after that.
Do you think it was mainly incentive, or like like maybe sometimes you're better players because they're just doing an awful lot more, can often be fatigued going into fitness tests. Can that be a part of it as well? Or like obviously you'd know more about the context at the time.
No, but I think when I would always say to people anyway, it's very hard to do a fitness test or a strength test or whatever test you're going to do and then say, right, for the next 4 to 6 weeks, that's going to determine my program. We all know that there's so many variables, and that's the problem. The human body is a variable. It's not a fixed thing. So I'm not going to be able to tell you why your 80% 1RM is going to be in 4 weeks. That's not really the way it works. So I would have been the same with a fitness test. At the time, I would have said, okay, the fitness test, they got this in the fitness test. So that prescribed my HIIT session now for the next 6 weeks. I wouldn't do that again. I kind of look at it a bit differently. But when we did do the GPS stuff up in Dublin that time, I was there going, jeepers, these lads are covering huge amounts of mileage and they're not doing that in the fitness test. So the other element is, of course, if you put all your eggs into that one day, so let's say it's a Wednesday, you say, okay, on a Wednesday of this particular month of this particular year, that was your fitness, but that's not necessarily where your fitness is going to be in 6 weeks. So maybe because when we did the fitness test and then we looked at the match, they were just fitter. You could argue that they were just fitter, so they did better. They covered more distance. But I do think lads just do not like fitness tests. If I told you to fitness test tomorrow, this stress response from the body and all the rest of it, some lads just don't do well in fitness tests. They just don't enjoy them. They don't like them. So it's hard then to come up with a fitness test and say that this is going to be the be all and end all, lads. This is going to decide the program for the next 6 weeks. I don't do that anymore. But at the time, I thought it was the right thing to do.
And you said if you were back again, you wouldn't concentrate so much on the condition. Do you mean in general conditioning, you'd focus more on the kind of the strength work, the movement work, or you try and condition through games a bit more?
Condition through games, definitely. I think that was the beauty of, I suppose we talked about it before we started. Like I use live heart rate monitoring with BlackRock. So we'd have 36 heart rate monitors that feed back data live straight away to the iPad. And depending on where the player is on the pitch, what position he's taking up, the distance, the square area he's in, the rules of the game, the motivation, all the things that are going to determine the intensity, I'd alter that based on the feedback. So like with, I suppose I like the idea of subjective versus objective. Objective is kind of me telling you fill in RP sessions and things like that. And subjective would be, okay, looking at heart rate monitoring, heart rate variability. We used CMJs as well to determine whether lads were going to sprint that day with BlackRock. And it was all about me kind of trying to facilitate the lads rather than me saying, look, whatever happens, this program's getting done, lads. Because again, it comes down to honesty. The player wants to get better, and you can't be saying to a player, what do you mean you didn't sleep last night? Well, that doesn't matter. We're covering this distance today and you're doing this drill today. I think the players, once they kind of see a bit of maybe performance enhancement, that they see that I'm actually getting better here, even though I'm not really doing as much running as I used to do, then they buy into it a bit more and they're a bit more honest with you, and they'll come up and say, look, I didn't make my jumps, Steve. And I said, that's, you know the story, we're not sprinting today. And he said, okay. And that's the way it was then for me. Like I didn't allow a lot of a lad's control. Whereas back in the minors, they were filling out stuff every night. They were filling out how they felt and all the stuff we normally fill out, muscle soreness and things like that. But I wouldn't do that anymore. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm not sure. That would be open to interpretation, I guess.
Just 2 points I want to build on there. The first one, you said that when you say to players, listen, your jump is down, you're not going to be sprinting tonight. Does that take a bit of time to build up, to show to players, first of all, that doing the sprints provides massive benefit, and then the buy-in from them is that, oh, I really want to do my sprints because I know that makes me better. So it's kind of like, it's almost like in school, say, you try and make PE as enjoyable as possible, so that the worst punishment of all is you're not allowed to do it, as opposed to whatever that way. Does that take a bit of time to get buy-in from?
Yeah, like, I mean, I would always say to lads, players or kids, like, you know, they're adults that are actually kids. You know, they love playing the game. They still love chasing. They still love racing. They obviously still love the game of hurling. So I tried to implement a fun element as much as possible. So sprints weren't actually sprints. They were races. So we would have raced over 40 meters. So we'd have 6 lads line up I'd go the whistle, and it'd be a race between 6 lads. And as I said, they're kids; they really buy into it. If you tell a fella, I need you to hit top speed, and we're going to hit this cone, you're going to be at 80%, and once we get past it, you're going to be at 100%. Whether the player is at 80% or 100%, I'm not sure. He can go hiding. He can decide, I'm not going to do this. I'm not really feeling that today. Whereas if it's a race and everyone's watching 6 lads racing at one go, we are hitting top speed. Like, we are getting that response. Like, I'd always say to people, for top speed, we race, and for acceleration work, we chase. So it's always a fun element to it, whether you have adults in front of you or not. And I think when lads thought, oh, I can't race, they kind of, as well, obviously, if you have somebody who decides, I'm not, maybe he'll tell you that he made his jumps or whatever. Check the data, he hasn't made his jumps. And you say, oh, let's see what happens here. And he might say, oh, hamstring doesn't feel too good. And you're there going, maybe if you're 8 weeks out, you say, right, well, this is my chance to maybe say, look, lads, this isn't by accident that this particular injury has occurred. I've been saying it to you that you have to come in ready to train. And if you're not ready to train, we're not going to do certain things. So if you decide, I'm going to train anyway, and then come back to me and say a bit of a niggle there in the hamstring or the groin or whatever, so, well, I told you not to run, or I told you not to do this. And it's not about me being right. It's because obviously if they get injured, and it makes more, it means a lot more that the further you go in championship, if you get to quarterfinals and semi-finals, they know that, like, jeepers, if I do something silly here, I'm out of the big game. Like, and they'll obviously buy into that straight away then and say, okay, well, I have to look after myself a bit better.
Yeah, I love that there now on to get faster we race, to improve on acceleration we chase them, like, because it's something I've known with the minors lately as well, is setting up the races, and just their speed has come on so much from having that extra incentive, and even course, like they'll line up in 3s and 4s, but even stagger the starts. So one that starts 2 yards ahead, or one that starts 2 yards behind, and just the extra effort they're putting in is
and
huge.
This is it, and I think no player needs to know that top end speed obviously improves rate of force development, bulletproofs the hamstrings a bit better, and all the rest of that. Players don't need to know that. If you tell them there's a cone there and we're going to have a race with 5 other fellas, that's all they need to know. And as you said, John, it's intent, like, because if you don't have intent, it's not top speed anymore. And it'd be great if we all had GPS units and we'd look at the live data and say, oh, he's not at top speed, he's bluffing it. But I think, like, even when we did recovery sessions with Blackrock and Blarney, we played a game. I kind of coined it kind of like a hurling volleyball, basically, where we had like 10 lads on one side of the net and 10 lads on the other in the Astro. And I'd say, right, 8 lads have to touch the ball and then send it over the net, and then 8 lads on this before you send it over, and you scored it like volleyball. Like, and as I said, they're just kids, they love that. And I'm still getting them to move, but the other option, of course, would have been and options I would have done in the past was we would have gone on to spin bikes for 25 minutes and kept the heart rate between 130 and 150 and done all that recovery stuff. But there's other ways of doing things, like, and if you can bring in as much fun as you can, then I'd sooner do it that way, because it's great for culture in a group as well. It's not all about numbers and things at the end. It is in my own head, but the lads don't need to know about that.
I'd be very same when you bring the rugby ball or the Olympic handballs, hurling training, they're all like, oh, what's going on here? And suddenly, like, there's a bit of life in everyone again. Exactly, sorry, Damien, I cut across you there a second ago.
No, I was just going to kind of mention something there that we've brought up in previous podcasts, is the relationship building with your players, and that it's one thing you're on your end and you're watching the data, you're tracking how things are going, and but to get, and even with the fun aspects of training, but to get the buy-in from the players that they need to you need to build up that trust and that relationship, that they kind of trust that everything you're doing is going to bring out the best version of them. And so have you I suppose, is there much that you do with trying to build up that relationship with players or with teams when you go in, or do you kind of just leave it gradually kind of naturally build, or is there any kind of things that you do, because there's so much riding on that, as I said, it's all well and good to have all the knowledge and know-how of how to get someone to their best, but getting that buy-in and trust is huge.
It's hard, and it's especially hard if you start off with a team. You don't really know the team dynamic. You don't know who the jokers are, who the leaders are, and who the lads who are very serious about their sport. And I suppose I'd always put my personality on every team anyway. I have conversations. I try to have conversations with every single player on the pitch. You know, if it's a training session, I like the idea of me literally rocking up to a training session and maybe looking at the body language of the players and say, you know what, lads, today was meant to be a tough session, but I don't really see it in you. And maybe putting in something else, and then the players going, well, that's a bit different because normally you just get ran into the ground regardless. It comes down to education, I guess, as well. You know, that you're not there to, as I said before, the program doesn't go ahead in spite of the player. You know, the program goes ahead because of the player, and if the player doesn't want to be there in any way, shape, or form, and I would have talked to underage coaches who want to do all the fundamental movement stuff, which is great, but you don't want to take up the whole session. You don't want a very serious session lasting 40 minutes and then at the end they play the game for 20. You know, that's not what they showed up for. They showed up to play the game. And I'd always say to people, and again, what we talked about before we started was, as much as you have to justify what you've put in, you obviously have to justify what you've taken out as well. If you've put in half an hour of speed mechanics and the session's only 60 minutes long and you've got under 15s or 14s, you're saying, well, we've taken out half an hour of hurling now. Is it worth that? Is there that much? Like, I mean, it's the same at every age group. Like, the lads want to play the game. That's why they showed up. When you get to the county scene and into county and all that, you obviously have maybe a more serious individual, and maybe you can go into more detail like that. But if you're in a club setting, it's all about retaining, first of all, that you want lads to really bounce out of the cars and run onto the training pitch. But you wanted them to know as well that you're there for them and that you do have their best interests at heart, you know, and you're not running a dictatorship that things happen, whatever happens, the program's still going ahead. So I suppose to answer the question, yeah, I get to know the lads. Some lads are quiet anyway. You might not know that when you show up. Maybe the team itself is very quiet, so you have to create a game that gets them talking. And there's ways and means of doing that too. You can just create some game that has to be talked about. You can blindfold them and say, right, start throwing the balls there, lads. You're going to have to communicate with each other, you know. And again, I love that idea where you have, again, I've talked about him before. A colleague of mine, like one of my best friends, would be Alan Dunton, like, and he's just done his PhD, like, and it's all about skill acquisition. And you can talk to an individual and say, I want you to hit the hurley this way and hold the hurley that way. But if you create a constraint and say, look, actually, I'll create the constraints. You have to do these movements that I'm asking you to do rather than you overthinking it. And again, I suppose it touches about Nick Winkleman stuff as well with external and internal cueing. Just create the scenario and see what they do. Don't be having everyone standing around the cone for 10 minutes while you talk about stuff that may or may not happen in the drill, you know.
Yeah, I'm learning that a lot with helping out with the under sixes lately, trying to explain to them why the right hand should be on top is largely useless. It's having these either little tiny hurls, small scoops, or the ones that make up out of milk cartons, so they just grab it with their dominant hand and scoop with that. So they become in the habit of it through a load of fun games, as opposed to saying, no, you need your right hand on top now, because if your hands start to cross over each other and you're 24, they're gone. Just last thing I want to touch on there, back to when you were with the minors, you mentioned like the players came in and filled in the various monitoring questionnaires. Was that something you brought yourself? Was it something Cork GA wanted to try and use over time? Or because I know like majority of Leinster counties here will be asked to do that. It all goes into Smartabase, so that like they have a few years of that now for various minor teams.
Yeah.
Is it a Munster Council thing, or is it independent of Cork? Or
no, that was independent of myself. So I would have looked, obviously, the stuff we all do, the wellness questionnaires and things like that. But I wouldn't have been fully confident that the answers they were giving. It's the same when somebody goes into the gym and like we use VBT when we can with the two clubs. And then before that, we'd use RIR. So we use reps and reserves. So if you're a beginner going in and I'm telling, let's say, a minor that he has to do, let's say, a hex bar deadlift for 5 reps with 2 reps in reserve, does he even know what 2 reps in reserve is? Like when I ask a player, how does he feel out of 10? Is he of the age that he actually knows what that is like? And that's why I would have taken away some of that from the players, like by doing the heart rate monitoring or by doing the counter movement jumps before we started. Because I'm not confident that the answer is the right answer anyway. And I think you're only going to get good at it, obviously, the more often you do it. And like, obviously, when you talk to senior lads, they know what an 8 out of 10 is and they know what a 9 out of 10 is. But at an underage level, I'm not sure that you'll get an honest answer. And I did it with the 21s the following year with Cork, and I'd be looking for the sheets like maybe the night before training, and you'd be sending them out, and it just got to the stage where lads were there going, I'll just fill this out really quickly and just send it on, and you definitely weren't getting an honest result then, you know. So as they're going, it's up to me to either stand over them and drill into them the importance of this, or else I could say, you know, there must be another way around this, because how valuable are the answers that I'm getting back anyway? I'm not sure.
Yeah, especially if they're forced. Yeah, if guys are forgetting it, and so I've seen it, I do see it. You know, these constant reminders. Come on, guys, we need to know. We need this, and lads just kind of go, oh, right, Jesus, here, I'll fill it there, and you know they're off doing something else, and their mind is somewhere else. It's
Sorry, they learn to hate it. Like they don't like it, they don't enjoy it, they don't see the value in it, because all it is a tool that they keep getting beaten with because they haven't filled it in. So yeah, I can see the value at a certain age group, but I think at underage they don't know what 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10, or 8 out of 10 is. You know.
One of the main things we kind of want to get you on to discuss, Stephen, was looking kind of at your big rocks, when, you know, because you've worked with a few teams now. Like when you go in with a team, and like we've often discussed that sometimes the battles you might have with management over how much time do I get with these, when it increases, when it decreases. But like oftentimes in S&C, you're kind of given 20 minutes twice a week to get your work done. What like do you find yourself? Yes, this is what I'll definitely include there. This is what I'll get benefits from. And then if I was to get a bit more time, yeah, I'd start adding this in.
Yeah, well, obviously, I do top speed work with them, because most of the time when you go in with teams, as we all know, I'm sure that we do speed work all the time, and then when you actually break it down, they're not doing speed work. What they're doing is speed endurance work, and so saying, okay, that needs to be changed. So, from a bulletproof standpoint and things like that, we definitely do the speed work and we do the races. It's different for every team. I mean, if I was sitting down, I talk to people about what would the difference be between, let's say, Cork and a club team. When you're with Cork, like you have the best midfielder, you have the best defender, you have the best goalie, you have the best all these positions they're the best at. So that's why they're here. You know, they're the best in the county at them. When you're with a club team, you don't have that. You don't have that. You might have a player who strives to play into county, and you have another fella who just loves hanging around with his buddies. Saying, okay, well, do we need to spend way more time playing the game? Do I need to do these 20 minutes? Can we, like when people talk about squat mechanics with young kids, I'd say, well, I'll introduce that as part of the warm-up. I don't want that isolated so that lads are standing around for 10 minutes. We'll put in squat mechanics part of the warm-up. We'll put in running drills part of the warm-up. At least they're doing it often. If I was to do things, it depends on the underage section. Like, I mean, I started with the Blackrock Miners a couple of weeks back, and we're doing 1x20 now. So that's probably not something I'd have done in the past. So I really like it. It's hard to get buy-in from the players, but while the gyms were locked down, they didn't have a choice anyway. So we did 1x20. Could I sell that to a senior team? It'd be hard. If I was to do volume training with them and I suggested 1x20, I think that'd be a hard sell, but I just like the premise behind it. I like the idea that you can get 20 odd exercises done in one session. You only do one set. And obviously the benefits in terms of capillary density and mitochondrial density, and obviously getting exposed to not as high in intensity as it would be if you were doing, let's say, 3x10 on a back squat. Now, if you talk to players, they'll probably tell you what they want anyway. You know, they might say they need to be fitter. I'd look at resting heart rates straight away and say, okay, well, look at resting heart rates, and for the next 4 weeks, we might determine what fitness level needs to be improved.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you have any ranges on resting heart rate that you're generally looking for?
I'd love to have lads in around the high 40s. You know, just every time you do a test, the next question is, what should I be getting? And you're there going, well, where are you now, and how much can we improve you? So obviously, if you have a resting heart rate of 70, the room for improvement is huge. Somebody comes up with a resting heart rate of, Lance Armstrong had his resting heart rate somewhere around the low 30s with his vitamins and minerals, but yeah. So like, I mean, I'd like team sport athletes to be around the high 40s, low 50s, just because, again, people put too much value on the high intensity work. Make everything high intensity, that'll change things, and the low intensity work kind of gets forgotten about. But the low intensity work, if it's done properly, will determine how well you recover from the high intensity work and how well you can do the high intensity work. So if I got a phone call from a team and they said, can we get you in for 6 weeks, I'd probably refuse it, because what would happen is you're forced to do high intensity because they want to see these numbers. They want to do a beep test beforehand. I'm not a big fan of the beep test. And they want to see the results at the end. And then here's your money, off you.
Best bang for their buck. Yeah, it's like, he came in and flogged them, and sure, look, here we are.
It's a strange situation, and that's I'd just be saying we get the bigger rocks. In the pre-season, I talked to an individual recently, got onto me on Instagram, and he said that the coach had said they should do a load of high intensity work in the off season. I was there. Why? High intensity is exactly what you're going to be doing. I've never talked to a team that didn't train hard. They all train hard. So the other stuff gets forgotten about. So you look at tempos, you look at cardiac output, you look at I'd look at resting heart rates. If I started off with a team straight away, probably wouldn't do a fitness test for about 6 to 8 weeks, and then maybe look at changing that after that.
Shane there has a resting heart rate of about 25.
Is he?
Oh yeah.
The heart the size of an elephant.
A bit of an anatomical anomaly, shall we say. Do very little to no movement with scandalously high VO2 max scores and stuff. So I'm trying not to question it as best I can, or else I'm having the chicken fillets that are loaded with steroids and you just don't know about it.
When we were doing our masters, we were over in the physiology lab in Chester, and Shane volunteered. Oh, yeah, about a month out from world bodybuilding at that stage.
Yeah,
massively restricted calories, had only been lifting weights for ages, hopped up and got 80 in the VO2 max. and played a goal as a young fella as well. So it's not as if he had this massive base of cross country running there or anything.
I wanted to touch on something kind of brief. You almost said it as a throwaway comment, but did you say when you first got into S&C you were doing work with an ultimate frisbee team, or you were actually playing it yourself? What was it like doing S&C?
I said it, and I was on Billy O'Regan's podcast, and I said it as well. I had to work with obviously a lot of ultimate frisbee was in UCC. It's an ever-growing sport, and I would have always said that those athletes were more serious than any other athletes I had to deal with about their sport. It was a completely, I hadn't even heard of it. I got approached by one of the lads. I was doing a program for him out on the floor or whatever, and then he said, "Oh, Steve, I play ultimate frisbee." I'm there. What is that? And he introduced me to it, and I went out to the matches and I watched the matches. I said, "What are the rules in this?" But I suppose shoulder health was a big thing with ultimate frisbee. It's very stop-start, of course, but it's taken very seriously. I found every time we had to run squad sessions, there's a waiting list. There wasn't enough space for the amount of athletes that wanted to come in, and you didn't have that with every team. I just found it really enjoyable to work with a team like that. It was completely out of my comfort zone.
Because it's a really it's obviously a really niche sport, and nobody when you think of the most athletic teams in a certain college or anything like that, you'd never think of that. But I've used it a few times. It's a near perfect conditioning game because it kind of has everything. It's essentially boils down to jumping, running, catching, and throwing. Yeah. Everything you try to encapsulate. It's just such a it's so weird that it's obviously it's everyone buys into it so much, but it's not something you'd see as an athletic endeavor per se, just because you don't know so much about it. But it's I've used it almost as warm up or off season kind of games to kind of build culture and stuff. But it's just a phenomenal conditioning tool I found.
Yeah, there was a rumour that I'd been told that Declan Kidney had said he'd have used it a bit more in Munster if he'd found out about it earlier. But yeah, it's a fascinating sport to watch, but there's no ref. So I suppose people then say, oh, there's no ref, there must be no controversy, it must be all straightforward. There was talk about it being in the Olympics and all the rest of it, but I'm not sure how far they got with that.
I could definitely see it getting to the Olympics. I think as sports are growing and some of the stuff that has come in, I could definitely see ultimate frisbee getting in. I think the self-refereeing is really interesting. That I suppose the level of morality you have to have about yourself as a player to call that foul when you've taken a step. You're like, oh yeah, that was me. You'll
be worried as the stakes get higher, you'll get more lads going in cheating, saying
100%.
Yeah, that would be the problem, I suppose.
You see Johnny Knoxville entering in the US team.
Yeah.
Sorry, back to some of your big rocks there, like, and that's kind of on field doing your top speed work. If you're doing gym work, what's kind of, say you've a limited gym session, you're only getting once a week, what are some of the main things you're going to try and focus on in there?
Plyos, ISOs mainly. Well, not mainly, but I think again they're not focused on enough. I think if you go into the gym and you have lads who are doing a lot of squats, lunges, deadlifts, whatever they're doing, a lot of hip and knee and neglecting ankle. So I put a lot of emphasis in my programs with the calf, and so we'd use ISOs and plyos as part of a warm up. Wouldn't necessarily concentrate hugely on dynamic movements. They'd be in there, but they wouldn't be. They're not the have to do this, lads. You have to do that. Same with the foam rolling and stuff like that. You don't have to do that, lads. That's not mandatory. I'd recommend if you feel a bit stiff that day or tight or whatever. But definitely plyometrics. We start with ISOs, then we do plyos, and then obviously we're looking at, depending on the age group, we're looking at squat mechanics, push, pull, hip hinge. But again, I'd look at, like we do it with the miners now at the moment, Blackrock miners, a lot of extensive plyos with ankle hops and bunny hops and things like that. I've always said to people, the first thing you have to overcome on the pitch, the track, or the court is your own body weight. If you can't handle that, you're going to be in a bit of trouble. But most of the time, even when I was working with sprinters, you'd find really strong knees and hips and very weak ankles. So they had all this force that their knees and hips could produce. Their ankles just acted like sponges as they were running along. They couldn't. They never did like a lot of they do a lot of knee and hip plyometric kind of stuff, explosive stuff, but not a lot of ankle. Simple skipping, mad for skipping. If they could skip, probably be something I'd love to teach a young team. Like, bring in loads of jump ropes and say, right, lads, we're going to start to learn to skip. Just that awareness, even of pushing off the ball of the foot, would be very valuable, I think.
What kind of ISOs are you doing?
At the moment, we're kind of doing floating heel. So again, looking at stuff from Tommy John and Jake Tora and Alex Natera. So we're looking at if they're in a split lunge position with hip in line with the knee, with the ball of the foot on a 25 kg plate. So it's a floating heel, 30-second hold minimum either side. If they can do more, we kind of periodize that and go up to anywhere up to 45 to 60 seconds in that position. And then if we were looking at a kind of a PAP method, if let's say they're doing, let's say a rear full elevated split squat, we might do kind of an activation. So we do a PAP isometric for that in that position, holding it for about 5 seconds, 3 sets, and then they go into the exercise. So again, I think maybe years ago I'd have had loads of mobility stuff in, way too much mobility stuff, about 30 minutes of mobility stuff before they ever started. It was just crazy. Like, so now we do ISOs and plyos. We do might do the kind of activation, so CNS activation or local muscular activation, and then we would do the main lift, and then as part of the rest, we might put in dynamic movement exercises. So to make sure that they're getting that 2 or 3 minutes that they need. Like I said, with Blackrock and Blarney, at the start of the year, you're kind of in the gym more than you are on the pitch. So we use VBT, and then once you get onto the pitch and the hurling sessions and the clubs free up their pitches to be allowed to be trained on, you kind of obviously the gym becomes more of the kind of secondary thing that the lads do the gym in their own time. So we'll take out certain exercises that maybe erring on the side of caution. I wouldn't necessarily put in like 3 sets of 10 on a back squat in season or anything like that, because I think lads will get adventurous and something bad could happen. So we'll put in hex bar deadlifts or something like that. Might put in deficit hex bar deadlifts and go from there.
Just we've touched on it before, but just will you say what VBT is there for anyone?
Sorry, velocity based training. Yeah, so I'm lucky enough that I've 3 boxes, so 3 linear transducers. You put them onto the bar, and again, it comes back to that subjective objective thing that if I tell you I want you to bench 3 sets of 5 with 2 reps in reserve, that could be different on any given day. So I definitely say reps in reserve is better than percentage RMs, and then VBT is better than reps in reserve. So basically they have a target that they hit. They have to move the bar at a certain speed. If it's too fast, they need to put more weight on it. If it's too slow, they need to take the weight off. So they have that target again. You take away the onus from the player or athlete to put a certain weight on the bar. that they might just decide they're feeling brave today. Say, no,
Are you using Tendo or GymAware or what are they?
So we're using Speed for Lifts. Now Speed for Lifts have become Vitruve. Their software is very good. So I can do a full kind of force velocity profile off their software. So it'll tell me what their 1 rep max is, and we only have to go to about 75% or 1 rep max. It'll spit back what their 1 rep max is that day based on the speed they moved that particular weight at, and then you can that'll prescribe the session then. But it's very handy. I know it's not cheap, but I don't know how much the GymAwares are. They're not cheap, but the Speed for Lifts are about 400.
That's not bad at all.
No, they're not too bad
compared to like Tendo's GymAware. All like
yeah,
that.
you're talking upwards in the 2 or 3 grand or whatever there. I really like the software, and I like the units too. They're very reliable.
And you said you don't do much mobility anymore. This is a leading question, but is that because you don't think players need to be as flexible anymore, or have you found better ways of building that type of mobility?
I think it comes down to, again, we train through a full range of motion off season and pre-season in the gym to promote mobility. So if a fella, like the research is sketchy at best from what I've seen, is that if you improve range of motion, so let's say we do loads of stretching. So what I've found is lads who get hamstring injuries always stretch hamstrings, and they still get hamstring injuries. Because just because you're pulling the hamstring into a new range of motion doesn't mean it's getting stronger in that range of motion. So if I put in like an RDL, or I put in a Nordic, or I put in a staggered RDL, that is a mobility exercise if it's done through a full range of motion. You know, that's kind of, especially through the eccentric range, we are increasing mobility. So I'd kind of look at the particular exercise being done right through a full range of motion is a mobility exercise. Whereas if I put in what I used to do is when I was doing Olympic lifting and I was below average even below that as an Olympic lifter, I used to do fortunes of mobility work, and for no reason. But I don't think it was the mobility work that I could get into deep squat. It was the fact that I did loads of deep squats that got me into deep squat. So again, it's about looking at the time, saying, okay, most lads aren't going to tell you they have an hour and a half to spend in the gym. They're going to tell you, I have 40 minutes, Steve. So I'm not going to have you doing 20 minutes of mobility for that. So I'll look at the big rocks, say, I know ISOs work, I know plyos work, I know strength training works, and I know I need to give you a rest about 2 or 3 minutes at some stage during those exercises. So if you want to put in these extra mobility exercises, we'll throw them in there. I'm definitely not saying mobility is important. I think it is important. I'm just saying that stretching as part of a mobility session, I don't value as much as I used to. I just think we need to train through a full range of motion instead.
The means to achieving that mobility can be
Exactly,
done in a more kind of efficient way than just holding stretches. Like an awful lot of tightness comes from it's a safety mechanism, because your muscle does not feel safe going to that range of motion or that point under load, so it tightens up to stop you from getting there. So by getting stronger through that range, that automatically increased mobility.
Yeah, and like, I mean, we did, to the start of preseason, we did Nordics. We did Nordics and reverse Nordics as part of just that was our cool down. Like, and people would say, you're doing strength work as part of your cool down. I say, well, looking at the papers, like people used to do Nordics at the start of sessions, but it would then decrease speed. So people said, okay, that's great, nobody got hamstring injuries, but that was the safety mechanism. They took away the strength and power that the hamstring was able to produce, so then they couldn't go as fast. So that was the safety mechanism, that the hamstring wouldn't go. So I said, I don't really want that. So we put Nordics at the end. But then, even saying that, like, I know Keith Barr now was talking that his theory that Nordics, it's great, hamstring injuries are down, but ACLs are up. And he reckons that co-contraction between hamstrings and quads is getting affected. And somebody celebrating low hamstring injuries but still getting 2 or 3 ACLs is not a cause for celebration, you know. So again, it just raises loads of questions more than answers, unfortunately.
Just while we're on cooldowns there, are you doing much, static stretches, 30-second holds there at the end? Have you found a smarter way to do that? Are you even, it's something I'm tying with an awful lot lately, is a cooldown actually, bar after a game when you want to have a debrief, is a cooldown really physiologically worth it?
It's a great question. If any of my players are listening, they'll have me shot now. But I think a cool down I think it's not as important as it's made out to be, unless you're doing maybe double sessions in the day. I think it's also a part of a training session that a player has to warm up and he has to cool down. So certain things I do in warm-ups and cool downs because I know the players expect that. And if it's not done, why, they just think it just messes with their mind a bit. Well, we didn't do any stretches. We have to do stretches. And then you could have an argument with the player saying, well, tell me what stretches do. And they won't be able to tell you, but it's just a part of training. It's been a part of training for our last, whatever age you're talking to the player at. If he's a 25, maybe he's been doing it for the last 15, 18 years, whatever it is. So we just do it. Like, I don't think it's as important as people make it out to be. I think the muscle will go back to full range of motion without you needing to stretch it. Lactate doesn't stay in the muscle. We know that. If you wanted to clear lactate, maybe the end got him used to kind of lactate shuttle and stuff like that. There's an argument for it. Well, I'm not sure. But stretching as part of a cool down, I do it, but I don't place as much value in it as maybe the players do, if I'm honest. And hopefully none of them are listening. Like, the players run the cool down as such, and I'm strict with the way they run it. But if I thought it was very important, I wouldn't have them run it. Would be the simplest answer, I suppose.
And then just onto, like, we've kind of identified a few of the big rocks. What's some stuff you kind of see being done or an overemphasis on? Like we discussed there, that 6-week block of HIIT. And oftentimes you're doing it to try and justify yourself being there to the manager or to the chairman who signs the check. Like, I improved wrong K times. Because you do have to balance, like, giving yourself worth to those who aren't as in the know of, like, how it all works. But what are the things that maybe aren't as effective, or, like, if you had loads of time, I put them in. If I don't, that's the first thing that's gone.
No, like, I think, and I talked to Barry about this, Barry O'Brien at Connacht. Like, I think if you when we did a fitness test with Blackrock and Blarney, we do the 30-15 IFT. So we did a fitness test, and the players were informed that if they hit a certain number in the IFT, I'm happy they don't have to do any extra running. Because if a player is full back or full forward, how fit does he really need to be to play that position? And let's say some of the freaks that were involved with Blackrock and Blarney were getting 20.5, 21.5, and they're going, I could sit down and say, getting this fella fitter is going to make him a much better player. But that's not true, because if you have somebody at that level of fitness, which is more than acceptable to play into county level, by pushing him further, you're exposing him to more risk of injury, because he's now got to push harder. He's already at a high fitness level. So what's the merit in saying, get fitter? All the answers seem to be, get the players fitter. And you say, well, he's as fit as he needs to be. All we need to do is maintain that fitness. Obviously working on speed and explosivity and strength and stuff like that. But in terms of running the legs off lads as a justification to get a fellow who's already fit up to another level, I'm not so mad about that. So I think when people go in, they put way too much emphasis in that side of things, saying everyone needs to get fitter. And I think probably something we talked about off air as well was having that idea that conditioning is one block and the hurling session is another block is also false, because hurling is conditioning. That's what it is. You can't play hurling without needing some level of conditioning. So the drills that the coaches may be doing or the small sided games they may be doing is still a conditioning emphasis. And I think that needs to be acknowledged by the SNC and say, well, look, that's a very good drill. It's actually quite high intense. It's doing everything I need it to do. So I don't need to do this other stuff. This idea that lads would start off or end the session with loads and loads of running, I think is a bad road to go down. I think it was something I definitely did at the start, because I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I have to improve everybody's conditioning. Whereas in a lot of ways, I should have just sat back and said, do you know what? He's as fit as he needs to be for that position that he's going to be playing in. And even if he gets put in, if he's a full forward, he gets thrown into the half forward line or wherever he's going, he's still fit enough. I don't need to run him that much. I just need to maintain that fitness. And we know maintaining fitness is a lot easier than improving fitness. So that would be my probably thing to do, like that I would say, this fella's fit. He doesn't need to do as much as everybody else, and kind of pull them from the sessions, because again, I would look at the data, look at the CMJ, look at the heart rate monitoring and say, he's not normally in red this long, lads. We need to pull him. So you might pull him from the session then, and he might sit on the bench next to you and tell you, yeah, I don't feel good, Steve. I didn't eat much today and I didn't sleep well last night. So you should have told me that before we started, but because we've done the markers are saying that anyway, so the lads know what the story is,
And have you much experience with GPS? You mentioned you're using it with the minors once or twice. Is it something that like if you had more access, you'd be like, oh yeah, great, or do you feel like cost to benefit ratio, not sure it's worth it?
Cost to benefit, I wouldn't say it was worth it. No, I mean, I'd always liken it to. It's probably controversial, but I'm old enough now not to care, to be honest. I think like you had, let's say if we bring it back to, let's say we did a 1 rep max test on a bench and you get 100 kg on a Monday on the second week in December, third week in December, or whatever week we're in. I say, so that was one marker. So if you sit down with a player and you tell him he needs to cover 1,500 meters and 500 meters of high intensity, 1,500 of high intensity and 500 of very high intensity. If again the program goes ahead in spite of the player, it's no wonder they're going to get injured. It's like saying to a fella, okay, you did 100 kg there, so you're going to do 100 kg, 110 kg in 2 weeks. He may or may not be ready for that. So I like the idea a bit better with, like, we use iTrimp with the heart rate monitoring, like, so it would look at exposure in the red and the orange zones and say he's like, I have data with Blackrock this year that showed that 8 of the lads that spend most of the time with high iTrimp scores were getting some kind of niggles. It wasn't detrimental. We didn't have many soft tissue injuries this year, luckily. So we would have pulled them early from the session. Said, you know what, they're too high in the red and they're too high in the orange. The GPS wouldn't have told me that. Like, the GPS would have told me when he broke down, because the GPS would have stopped. But I have GPS units myself, but I don't, like, I only have 2 or 3, and I wouldn't see them as the be all and end all. I put them on not as a way to kind of prescribe the session. I'd look at a way of monitoring the session, say, okay, he covered 1,200 meters for this session. We'll see him again for the next session, see how he goes. I wouldn't necessarily say to a player, you have to cover 1,500 meters today. And again, it comes down to, even if you try to replicate it and you'd see lads doing top ups at the end of matches and stuff, is it the same thing? I'm not sure. The XL and decel specifically is not going to be the same when lads are doing straight line running. So it's very expensive monitoring tool.
It can be hard to sometimes as well explain what you're looking for from GPS to a manager, that like sometimes you do your report after a game and I think you put up distance cover just because everyone wants to see it anyway. One lad who might have gotten 4 touches of the ball, his man took him for 1-4, but he covered like 11k, and I was like, well done, Damien, good game there. And you're like, were you watching the game at all, or are you just looking at like distance covered?
I didn't concede 1-4 at all, Murph. You can jog on.
But it's funny because we looked at, again, talking about Shane Malone's work, where he looked at the small-sided games and the 4v4s. When I'm programming for the small-sided games or large-sided games, people forget that there's a lot of acceleration and deceleration in small-sided games, and they may be a great conditioning tool, but it's tough on the body, like, to lads. Whereas if you do a large-sided game, obviously we don't have as much XL, decel. We've more exposure to top-end speed, but that all has to be, and that's all looking at the session again and saying, well, this has been covered in that. I'm not gonna do like mad runs after this or before this, because you have to acknowledge again what's actually going to happen, regardless of what you put into the program. The manager, more often than not, isn't thinking those numbers at all. Like, you're just saying, right, Steve does his thing there for 20 minutes, and then I'll do my thing for an hour and 20 minutes, and you're there going, this could get messy pretty fast, lads. So you kind of gauge what the coach wants to do and say, okay, well, tell you what, put the cone out 10 meters further, or put this over here, or make the square area that bit bigger, and I'll tell you how many sets and how many minutes that you go for, and we'll go from there. So everyone's half happy anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a big thing working in with coaches in that regard. Like, most of my work now is in rugby, and it's similar thing. I've spent the last year and a half at the club I'm in just consistently saying, I want the ball in the lads' hands. If we're just running and the ball isn't going through their hands, then we're not going anywhere. And coaches are like, whoa, all right, okay, well, this is what I was hoping to do. And you just make small changes and you can get a lot more out of it. But I do find that that coaches who are specific to the sport, without any S&C background, or not necessarily in education, but just experience with it, or maybe have had experience with maybe poorer coaches or something, and they're kind of blown away by like, whoa, okay, right, all right, so you want us playing the game. It's a big shock to some.
Yeah, some actually get threatened by it. I've had that too. Like, say, no, you're the conditioning coach. You don't have anything to do with the game. You're going, well, that's not going to work.
You're not allowed to touch the footballs.
They stay in the bag until I blow the whistle.
Cones here. So you look after them.
But as well, like and people as well, when you take away the game, like I'm working with a former inter-county player at the moment, and like she was there going, should I keep hurling? Like, should I keep doing the alley? I said, yeah. I said, do you realize how technical and how fast hurling is? I said, if you give that up for 3 months, when you get back, you'll be in great condition, but you won't be able to hurl. Like, so what's the point in that? So it's always about, don't forget why you're here, you know.
Sometimes that can be a limiter on small-sided games, the skill level of players. And I find it more so in hurling than anything else, just because there are more skills. Bringing me hurling bias into it again. Hurling is way more skillful than everything else. But like a lack of skill can have so many games breaking down, and the intensity drops because of that, just because balls keep dropping. They're not capable of giving all the passes that are required, that you do have to factor in times as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because we, again, going back to the club scenario where you have a fellow who wants to be in the inter-county setup and you have a fellow who just enjoys being with the lads. With this season with Blarney Blackrock, our main conditioning protocols, I suppose, would have been either backspin forwards or full games, because it was position specific. It was you didn't have a fullback thinking he was a full forward at any stage, really. You know, if you had to bring in maybe 4v4 and there was a goal on one end and a goal on the other, lads get really frustrated that they don't have the skill level. And it's not that those skill levels aren't really expected in the full game, in the club game that they have to play, but it's expected in training. And then, you just kind of have to, where possible anyway. I mean, every so often you'd switch lads just for just to switch things up a bit, like, but for the main, you'd keep players in their positions, because 9 times out of 10 they're not going to move too much from that position. So let's get them exposed to, let's get the starting forwards being marked by the starting backs, and maybe switch lads out every so often if you think maybe maybe if you have a forward who's not as good as the forward that's in there, but you might bring him in when the back gets tired, just to keep the back keep getting them challenged, really, I suppose. But it's all, again, looking at the game and saying, I suppose the big thing, as I'd said already, the conditioning happens because of the player. It's not in spite of them. Like, you can't just say, oh, we're going to come up with this drill and all the rest of it. As I said, I'd take out more things than I put in, if I'm honest. But that's just the way I see it anyway, the way it works for me anyway.
Shane or Damien, have you anything else you want to touch on there? Because I'm conscious we're after taking over an hour now at Stephen's time.
No, I'm good. That's been fantastic. Leaving you run with things yourself is
I tend to talk, unfortunately.
Not at all.
That's it. That was perfect, Stephen. Stephen, where can people find you there if you want to find out any more? Because I know, like, on Instagram and stuff, you put up kind of polls on your story and stuff, and it's an interesting way of doing education. It's good. Like, I really enjoy, ask people a question so they're more kind of invested in finding out the answer and stuff then.
Yeah, like, I suppose my main protocol, my website's kcperformance.ie, and if people want to get on there, I'm on Twitter, Stephen Casey, but I suppose Instagram is the way people mostly get onto me, just at KC Performance. I do put up the polls every so often. A lot of lads get a kick out of them. Some of the answers are controversial, but I don't get many arguments, unfortunately. I'm still waiting that. But I put them up every so often, because I try to put up questions that force people to think rather than putting up easy questions, I guess.
You're like the Irish version of Bill Campbell with his questions that he puts up.
Yeah, he's something else, isn't he? That's what I should have
really
done. Started putting up on my posts, not on my stories. But we live and we learn.
Just start tagging him in them all now, spam him completely.
He's got a good setup there, though, the way he's done it, in fairness to him.
No, that's lovely, Stephen. Hopefully now another year when you're after bringing Blackrock 2 in a row, or when in 2 years' time when Blackrock and Blarney are playing the senior county final, you're trying to balance S&C on both sides. We'll have you on to discuss that.
We'll have a moral argument in my head then about that.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Stephen. And here, or you will hear us hopefully next week.